This is the Biz News Podcast, one-on-one conversations with experts in business and personal development.
This is a story you might say is about commercial real estate, but more realistically, it's about a tenacious descendant. It goes back to the 1930s in Germany when the Nazis forced a family to give up their family-owned business and its textile factory. Fast forward to the end of the 20th century, and psychiatrist Dr. Joanne Intrator, who picks up the story in this Bizgnus Interview podcast.
It really starts at my father's deathbed. I went to visit him, to see him. He was in Palm Beach, and I knew it was coming towards the end of his life. And I was there with him in his hospital room, and he looked very deeply sleeping, or maybe even in a coma. So I turned the television off and I sat there, and all of a sudden he sat right up and looked at me. And he looked at me as if he were a much younger man. And he said to me, "Are you tough enough yet? And do they know who you are?" And he went and lay down again. And those were the last words I'd ever heard from my father. He died within a day. And I thought about what he said, and I had an idea of what was on his mind. A year before, or shortly after the Berlin Wall fell down, which created the largest piece of real estate parcel in the world at that time, he had learned that a building owned by his father in what's called Mitte, the center of Berlin, the historic center of Berlin that had been hidden by the wall, this large manufacturing building had our family's name in what's called the Grundbuch, which is the history of the ownership of the building. And he knew that since I've always been interested in Germany and his background and studied German history, that I would be very interested in taking over his role in this case. He also knew that I'd be terribly afraid, Douglas, that I'd always had anxiety about Germany. And actually in 1967, he rescued me when I was in Berlin doing an errand for the family, and I couldn't continue. He said, "Joanne, you can come home." So he knew that I'd be both interested in this case and quite fearful. So he was throwing a gauntlet down and saying, "These are my last words to you, Joanne. This is how I'm presenting this case to you." A couple months afterwards, a very distinguished lawyer from Germany, from Berlin, came to see my brother and myself at the Waldorf Astoria. And he told us about the case. He was going to be the lawyer for the family. The family consisted of my brother and my uncle Alex, who was in his middle 90s, and another portion of the family. And he explained to us that there was a bit of a problem that we probably weren't aware of, which is that there was another business, the descendants of another business that were claiming that the building was theirs. And the building was taken from our family in September of 1938, just to put it in perspective. These descendants claimed my grandfather was a bad businessman, and that's why the building went to a forced auction, and these businessmen took the property over. And I said to our lawyer, "That's absolutely absurd. 1938, 5 years into the Nazi regime, my grandfather was broke. The Nazis were bleeding him with these exorbitant taxes. How could he pay his mortgage?" He said, "The lawyer said, again, you've got to prove that anti-Semitism was the cause of this auction." I thought this was patently absurd. And I thought it was like, this is a joke. This is ridiculous. My whole life has been about this anti-Semitism in Germany. It brought both my parents to the United States, and it's been the background shadow of my whole life. So I didn't really think that this was much of an issue. And when I said that to him, he said, I'm not so sure you're correct, because there's no paperwork about the auction. I said, why is there no paperwork? He said, the Gestapo burned all the files. So I said to him, who gets a building in 1938 without Nazi connections? This doesn't make any sense to me. And he said, this is what's going to happen. He said, your family is very likely to win the first round in the judicial sector of Berlin for these kinds of property, but they're going to take you to appeals court, and it's going to cost you a great deal of money. And by then, all your older members of the family will be dead. At the time, I couldn't grasp the horror of that statement. It just sort of went over me. And only upon thinking about that meeting did I realize that that was very cruel. My father had just died. My uncle was 95. And he was saying that the large part of our family would be dead. So I was really perplexed. But my brother and I, my brother was with me at the meeting, we said to the lawyer, this is really patently absurd. Well, the lawyer then said, I have an idea. Why don't you join forces with the opponents? And I looked at him. You want us to like share a dessert? You want to? Is that what you're saying? And I said, we're not going to do that. We just will not do that. And then he explained to us, that he was going to have us sign up for the case, and it was going to be a contingency case. So we would only give him a certain percentage of the building should he be successful. Should he not be successful, it wouldn't cost us anything. Again, I didn't think about what contingency meant at that time. I was kind of like overwhelmed by, the specter of my grandfather going through this, and the auction of the property, and my grandfather having no money, and my father having lost his job as both a lawyer and training as a judge. I couldn't get this all out of my head.
So Joanne, that takes us to the point where you decided to continue your legal efforts to gain control of the property. What was the bottom line after years of haggling in the courts in Germany?
It took 9 years, Douglas, 9 years. 9 years and many, many trips for me to come and leave my profession, leave my family, and go to Berlin and meet with these lawyers. And they continued to try to convince me to settle. So what happened is, somewhere into year 7, I hired an international investigative agency because I wasn't getting anywhere. My German wasn't good enough, and no one was answering any of my questions. So this international agency, this incredible investigator, found out very shortly, within just a number of weeks, that the people that took the building in the forced auction were actually tenants of my grandfather. So they were there actually since 1931. They were very aware of what was going to happen to my grandfather. The handwriting was on the wall, what was going to happen to Jewish owners of businesses. And shortly after that, he produced the Nazi Party memberships of these people. And there'd been Nazi Party members sitting there waiting for the right time to sort of pounce on the property. So that was already quite a shock. And I had been told it's not possible to get Nazi Party memberships, all of which was patently untrue. And then the investigator continued, and he found out that first, that the Nazi flags that you'd see in the 1936 Olympics, the big flags, all the, bunting that you see were produced in my grandfather's very large textile manufacturing building in the middle of Berlin. And then sort of within a year, he found out that 1 million Jewish stars were produced in the building in September of 1941. The first Jewish stars that were going to be placed on German Jews, such as my grandparents, who were still in Berlin at that time. And to me, that was just the most shameful piece of information. Unfortunately, by the time that happened, I negotiated to some degree with these other people, because I was never going to get out of this unless I put some money on the table.
So, Joanne, how did you get out of it? Did you find support from the German government at all?
Absolutely not. It was like a faceless bureaucracy. I was dealing with people that were not from really, the lawyers were from West Germany. The people that I was dealing with involved in these restitution cases had been under East German government, and they had no experience with democracy, and they lived their lives through bureaucracy. We don't know, these are just rumors, it's not possible, we don't have enough help. Those are the kinds of things that I kept hearing, and those are the kinds of things that egged me on.
And now that we are recording this years later, where does the building stand or not stand, or the property, I should say, and where does your relationship with it?
Well, the building was sold. In other words, an agreement was made with the opponents. The opponents originally wanted anywhere between 30 and 50%. They ultimately only got 12%. But I had to continue my life. I had to move on. And so the building was sold, and it's had several owners, and building has been beautifully updated and looks quite different than when I first saw it. It's a very popular building in a popular area that was somewhat deserted when I started going over there. And the last time I was in the building was in 2018, when a plaque was placed on the building stating what had occurred here, that the Jewish stars were manufactured in the building. And it was quite an event with several government people and lots of supporters of restitution and some friends. And it was very, very meaningful, and it meant a great deal to me.
Now, you have put this into a book. Tell us the name of the book and what's been the reaction.
Well, the book is called Summons to Berlin, and the reaction is not published yet, will be published next year, and I'll be delighted to come on the show one more time and tell you all about that. But the people that have read it have been very enthusiastic about it, because not only do I tell the story of the case, but I tell the story from the point of view of being a psychiatrist with some expertise in character pathology and understanding the history of the Nazis and how that happened in Germany. So the story is written as me as an observer, but also me as the person that's going through it, that had an enormous amount of fear of going to Germany and had to overcome my fear to be successful.
As a scientist, and I guess we could say psychiatrists, doctors, etc., are indeed scientists at heart.
Yes.
How would you characterize the current German government relationship to their Nazi past?
I think some people are doing an incredible job of coming to terms with it. The people that I met once I was involved with the building after it was sold, there were several opportunities to meet many German people. There was a major exhibit in 2013 that included the building, and I was a guest of the German government at the time. It was the people that were involved in this were extremely sensitive to what happened, and really wanted to make up as much as they could, and they were very welcoming to me. And they were involved in looking at the architectural and archaeological history of this area in East Berlin that had been a wasteland, and trying to find some of the Jewish families whose properties had been destroyed. Obviously, there's, there are people that are kind of still stuck in that area. I didn't, fortunately, get too close to anybody like that. But Germany is very interesting right now, particularly Berlin, because Russian Jews came there, 10, 15 years ago. Lots of Israelis. It's become such an international city, such a sophisticated city. It always was before the war, and now it's getting some of that back again. So I find myself always kind of thrilled to be there, but a teeny bit wary. As I walk through the streets where my grandparents lived, and I go in areas that I know the Nazi history, I get a little bit anxious, but I remind myself of the courage that I had to do this, and what my father said to me, his last words, to encourage me to do this. And I think of him, and when I gave this talk, when the plaque was put, I could imagine him in the room with me, really like applauding me.
You've been watching the Biznews Podcast. We welcome your input. Send your email to editor@biznews.com. Thanks for watching.